Hello, I'm Gary Ford, Managing Director of Tiger Hobbies Limited, UK hobby importers and distributors, and welcome to episode 1, the Australians in the Southwest Pacific. At the start of World War II, the Australian Army had about 3,000 full-time soldiers, backed up by about 80,000 militia, and the Australian Prime Minister, Robert Menzies, called up half of the militia for training and soon developed a force of some 20,000 for overseas service. Conscription was introduced in October 1939, and by 1941 most of the Australian Army overseas was supporting the British in the Middle East and North Africa. In North Africa, their heroic defence of Tobruk from April to November 1941 frustrated Rommel and gained the nickname the Rats of Tobruk. As we are chatting, I'm showing a clip from the old movie The Rats of Tobruk. The Australians were some of the toughest fighters within the 8th Army and Middle East Command, and were greatly missed when the Australian government withdrew them. The Australians were involved also with the defence of Singapore and were caught up in that horrendous disaster, with 15,000 captured and suffering 75% of the battle casualties, even though they were only some 15% of the total force. As well as the Australian Army, many Australians were in service with the Royal Air Force in both fighter and bomber command, and later in the war their own Royal Australian Air Force squadrons. But these personnel mainly remained in the UK theatre, while most Australians were sent home by the end of the First Battle of El Alamein in July of 1942. The northern town of Darwin had been identified as a crucial to the Allies for the defence of Northern Australia and a stepping stone for the offensives further afield in New Guinea and other places. The Australians started to build bases near the town and improve the naval and port infrastructure. The United States Army Air Force had also identified the area to base long-range bombers even before the war started. Even though Darwin was of strategic value to the Allies, it was not particularly well defended, without even an up-to-date fighter in the area and only converted trainers, of which none were serviceable. A flight of United States Army Air Force P-40s were passing through, but their pilots were generally inexperienced and not long out of training. The harbour was crammed with naval and support ships, so the scene was set for a bit of a disaster, and this was over 2 months after Pearl Harbor, so they should have been expecting it, with the Japanese bearing down on them. On the 19th of February 1942, a strong force of Japanese aircraft numbering almost 250, including land-based bombers, struck the town and its harbours, destroying almost all the aircraft on the ground, sinking 11 ships plus killing about 240 and wounding up to 400. I've used the clip from the 2008 movie Australia to show the raid. Yes, it's a little bit Hollywood, but shows a flavour of the raid. Also, the 4 Japanese carriers sunk at Midway were the carriers that carried out the Darwin raids, and Darwin and Northern Australia will be raided another 100 times up to late 1943. The raid on Darwin was a massive shock to the Australians and resulted in the withdrawal of troops from the Middle East and the massive build-up of both Australian and US forces in the Northern Territories. Within weeks of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, their forces advanced thousands of miles and by January of 1942 had captured Rabaul in New Britain and invaded the western part of New Guinea and the Dutch East Indies and Timor. And by March of 1942, they had taken Goa and Buna in northeast of Port Moresby. But it was Port Moresby that would be the Japanese priority, as this would be the springboard to invade Australia. The Supreme Commander now of the Southwest Pacific area was now General Douglas MacArthur. He also wanted the capture of New Guinea as his springboard to get the Philippines back. The Japanese first attempt at Port Moresby was through naval power in the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, talked about in our last series about the Pacific. In this battle, the US Navy lost more than the Japanese, but scored a strategic victory and secured Port Moresby by driving the Japanese fleet away. The Japanese decided they would take Port Moresby by land over the Owen Stanley Mountains and the Kokoda Trail, plus establishing a forward position at the east at Milne Bay. This would set the scene for the first major battles between the Japanese and Australian forces in New Guinea. By July 1942, the Japanese had landed some 12,000 at Goa and Buna and were soon advancing on the Kokoda track that goes from Buna to Port Moresby for about 90 kilometres. The initial forces facing the Japanese were a New Guinea force of native troops backed up by Australian troops. These troops fought very well, but were pushed back by superior Japanese forces. The Australians were just not equipped for jungle warfare and carried few heavy weapons, but the Japanese had mule-carried jungle howitzers and heavy mortars. Also, the Australians, like the British in Malaya and Burma, had uniforms suited for the desert, exposing arms and legs to insect bites and sharp jungle foliage. The Japanese took Kokoda and its airfield, and the Australians, even with reinforcements, were again pushed back almost over the Owen Stanley Ranges within 25 miles of Port Moresby. In early September 1942, at a place called Mission Ridge, Brigadier Arnold Potts, who had fought a fighting retreat against the Japanese along the Kokoda Trail, finally dug in to stop the Japanese. Potts' 21st Brigade fought like tigers to stop the Japanese, but the Japanese outflanked the Australians, separating battalions from their brigade HQs. But more counterattacks by the Australians soon got these units back together. More rearguard fighting took the Australians back to a place called Uambairawa, I hope I've got that pronunciation right, where the remains of the 21st Brigade, joined by 25th Brigade, finally stopped the Japanese after brutal fighting and forced the Japanese into retreat, giving Japan its first major ground defeat of World War II. The troops were thanked for stopping the Japanese and saving Australia by being called cowards by General Blamey in the infamous Running Rabbit speech, and its commander Potts getting the sack. As a point of note, the Australian senior officers were under some pressure from General MacArthur to perform, and in his eyes the Australians were not performing, which is harsh after the bravery of the Australian soldier, many just young militiamen. We shall now look at the battle for Milne Bay, 25th of August to the 7th of September 1942. At a similar time as the Australians were trying to stop the Japanese on the Kokoda Trail, other Australians were fighting at a place called Milne Bay to the east on the very tip of New Guinea. The Japanese landed with an invasion force from Rabaul at night with no interference from the Royal Australian Air Force, and its main efforts to take the airfields at Milne Bay. Some of the Australians based at Milne Bay were veterans of the Siege of Tobruk, recently returned, and would be no pushover. The Japanese landed at Milne Bay and a smaller force on the north coast of New Guinea. The Japanese who landed on the north coast were completely destroyed by RAAF P-40 fighter bombers at dawn. The Japanese and Australian troops were fighting at night along the north coast of Milne Bay and getting closer to the main Australian defence lines of Airfield Number 3. As dawn broke, RAAF P-40 fighter bombers hit the Japanese landing areas, destroying their ammo and fuel supplies left in a lovely neat line along the beach. Their airfields were only 15 miles away, so they could spend lots of time on target. The militiamen of the 61st Battalion were slowing the Japanese down, but were taking high casualties, so were relieved by the 10th Battalion of the Australian Imperial Force, and these were the battle-hardened veterans of Tobruk. In the ensuing battle, they fought advancing Japanese tanks without anti-tank guns and lost many men, and were forced back, but fought so viciously it put the Japanese off from further attacks onto the Airfield Number 3. The Japanese now got some reinforcements in the form of Japanese Naval Marines to take the airfield, and on the evening of the 30th of August stormed the airfield across open ground, but were met with lots of Vickers heavy machine guns, the finest sustained fire weapon ever, and these ripped into the Japanese soldiers along with mortars. At dawn broke, P-40 started to come in and strafe the Japanese with their 650 caliber machine guns, killing many including their commander. The Japanese were broken, and General Cyril Cowles sent in the veterans of Tobruk to finish the job, and which they did by the 7th of September when the very last Japanese were evacuated. On the Kokoda track, the Australians defeated the Japanese, and at Milne Bay they defeated a powerful Japanese invasion force and smashed them, finally securing Port Moresby and Australia. Milne Bay and Kokoda battles turned the tide on the ground in the early part of the Pacific War and proved the Japanese were no supermen. The P-40E Kitty Hawk, or the Kitty as it's known by the Australians, its firepower and ability to operate in the most austere conditions where the Spitfire would have probably had problems, helped make the difference at Milne Bay. Its pilots pushing their Kitty Hawks to its limits against Japanese Zeros and warships, plus strafing Japanese snipers in the tops of the trees, while shivering and vomiting from the effects of malaria, plus your bowels were failing from dysentery, but you still kept flying. Behind me is a picture of Bloody Mary, a P-40E of 76 Squadron Royal Australian Air Force from our fantastic new Edward EDK 1185 Pacific Star set.